The morning mist clung to the cemetery like a ghost, silent and heavy. The first light of dawn had barely touched the gravestones when he appeared. A hunched figure in a tattered coat, his steps slow but deliberate. The locals of Willowbrook had grown used to the sight of the old homeless man who came every day without fail, his presence as constant as the rising sun. No one knew his name, and no one bothered to ask. To some, he was just another shadow on the edges of their busy lives, a man to be pitied or ignored. To others, he was a mystery, a silent specter who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his bent shoulders. He always went to the same grave, a small, weathered stone tucked beneath an old oak tree. The inscription had long faded, but he didn't need to read it. He knew every crack, every groove, as if it were a part of him. Every morning he would kneel, place a single wildflower, sometimes a dandelion, sometimes a buttercup, on the grave, and then sit in silence. Hours would pass, the wind would howl, the rain would fall, but he never left before whispering something too soft for anyone to hear. The townspeople had theories. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the bakery, swore he was a grieving widower. Teenagers dared each other to throw pebbles near him, laughing when he didn't react. The cemetery keeper, an old man named Gerald, simply sighed and let him be. But one person couldn't ignore the mystery any longer. Daniel, a young groundskeeper who had just started working there. There was something about the old man's devotion, the way his gnarled fingers trembled when he touched the grave, that made Daniel's chest ache. One cold morning, Daniel decided to follow him. Daniel moved quietly, keeping his distance as the old man shuffled through the rows of graves. The wind bit at his cheeks, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the stranger ahead. The man moved like someone who had walked this path 1,000 times, his feet knowing every dip in the earth, every hidden route. When he finally stopped at the familiar grave, Daniel ducked behind a nearby tree, heart pounding. He wasn't sure why he was hiding, but something told him the old man wouldn't welcome company. For a long time, nothing happened. The man just stood there, head bowed, his breath curling in the cold air. Then slowly he reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out something small, a photograph, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. Daniel squinted, trying to see, but the distance was too great. The man's shoulders shook, just once, before he pressed the photo to his chest and sank to his knees. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. This wasn't just some homeless man killing time. This was grief, raw and unending. He thought about walking away, leaving the stranger to his pain. But then the wind shifted, and a single word escaped the old man's lips. Margaret. The name hung in the air like a prayer. Daniel froze. He had seen that name before, on the grave he was now tending. Margaret Ellsworth, beloved wife, 1942 to 1968. A young life cut short, and this man, was he her husband? Before Daniel could decide what to do, a sharp noise cracked through the silence, a branch snapping underfoot. The old man's head whipped around, his eyes wide and startled. For a second, their gazes locked. Daniel expected anger, fear, even shame, but what he saw instead shattered him. Tears. The old man didn't speak. He just carefully tucked the photo back into his coat, stood, and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, heart racing, questions burning in his mind. Who was Margaret? And what had happened to the man who loved her so much that even decades later, he couldn't let go? The encounter haunted Daniel for days. He couldn't shake the image of the old man's trembling hands clutching that faded photograph, the way his voice had cracked when he whispered Margaret's name. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a gnawing need to understand. The next morning, instead of hiding, Daniel waited near the grave with 2 steaming cups of coffee. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, the kind of morning that felt both peaceful and heavy with unspoken stories. When the old man appeared, his steps slower than usual, he paused mid-stride, eyeing Daniel warily. For a moment, Daniel thought he might turn and leave. But then, with a quiet sigh, the man approached. Daniel held out one of the cups. "Thought you might need something warm," he said, keeping his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might scare the man away. The old man hesitated, then took the cup with a nod, his fingers brushing against Daniel's. rough and cold, like tree bark in winter. They stood in silence for a while, the steam from their coffee curling into the crisp air. Daniel didn't rush him. He had learned from working in the cemetery that some things couldn't be hurried: grief, trust, the unraveling of a life's secrets. Finally, the old man spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "You followed me the other day." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, tired and resigned. Daniel's face flushed, but he didn't deny it. "I did," he admitted. "I've seen you here every morning for months. I just, I wanted to know why." The old man took a slow sip of coffee, his gaze drifting to Margaret's grave. The silence stretched, but this time it felt different, like the calm before a storm, like the man was weighing whether or not to let someone in after so many years of solitude. Then, without looking at Daniel, he said, "She was my wife." 3 words, simple and devastating. Daniel's breath caught. The man's eyes stayed fixed on the gravestone, as if he were seeing not the weathered rock, but her face, her smile, the life they'd shared. "I was supposed to come home to her," he continued, his voice fraying at the edges. "But the war, it changes things. By the time I got back, she was gone. Not just gone, buried, alone." His grip tightened around the coffee cup, knuckles turning white. "I wasn't there when she needed me. And after that, well, the world doesn't much care for broken men." Daniel didn't know what to say. What could he possibly offer to a man who had lost so much? But the old man wasn't done. "I tried for a while, worked odd jobs, slept in shelters, but the drink got me, and then the streets did. Only place I ever felt human again was here." With her, he reached into his coat, pulling out the photograph, a young woman with bright eyes and a shy smile, her hair curled just so, like she'd taken time to prepare for the picture. 56 years, he murmured. 56 years, and I still see her in my dreams." Daniel swallowed hard, his own eyes stinging. He thought of all the times he'd seen this man mocked or ignored, all the assumptions people had made about him. Lazy, crazy, just another drunk who'd thrown his life away. But the truth was so much worse. This wasn't a man who'd chosen to give up. This was a man who'd had everything ripped from him and had spent half a century clinging to the only piece he had left. The old man wiped his face with a shaky hand, then straightened his shoulders as if bracing himself. "You're the first one who's ever asked," he said quietly. Then, with a nod that felt like both a thank you and a goodbye, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, the weight of his story settling like a stone in his chest. Daniel couldn't shake the old man's words from his mind. They echoed in his thoughts as he worked, as he ate, even as he tried to sleep at night. 56 years, a lifetime of grief carried alone. The next morning he returned to the cemetery earlier than usual, hoping to catch the old man again, but the grave stood empty, no sign of him anywhere. A knot of worry tightened in Daniel's stomach. Had he scared him off for good? Or worse, had something happened to him? The thought of the old man out there somewhere, cold and alone, was unbearable. Determined, Daniel decided to dig deeper. He started asking around town, careful not to make it obvious. At the diner, he casually mentioned the older gentleman who visits the cemetery to Betty, the waitress who'd worked there since the 70s. Her eyes softened immediately. "Oh, you mean Samuel," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Samuel Grayson. He used to come in here sometimes, years back. Always ordered the same thing. Black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Said it was his wife's favorite." She sighed, shaking her head. "Haven't seen him in ages, though. Last I heard, he was sleeping down by the old train yard. Samuel Grayson." The name made him real in a way he hadn't been before. Daniel thanked Betty and left, his resolve hardening. He drove to the train yard, an abandoned stretch of rusted tracks and crumbling warehouses on the edge of town. The place felt hollow, forgotten, just like Samuel. After searching for nearly an hour, Daniel spotted a makeshift shelter tucked between 2 freight cars, a tarp stretched over a frame of wooden pallets. His heart pounded as he approached, unsure if Samuel would even want to see him. But when he called out, there was no answer. The shelter was empty, save for a thin blanket, a dented tin cup, and, to Daniel's surprise, a small, carefully wrapped bundle tucked beneath a folded coat. Inside was a stack of letters, all addressed to Margaret, the paper brittle with age. Daniel didn't read them. That would have felt like a violation. But the sight of them, the sheer love in their existence, made his throat tighten. Where was Samuel now? Was he okay? Just as he was about to leave, a noise made him turn. Samuel stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel's gaze flicked to the letters in Daniel's hands, and something in his face shifted. Not anger, but resignation. "You're a persistent one," he muttered, though there was no malice in it. Daniel swallowed. "I was worried about you," he admitted. "You weren't at the cemetery today." Samuel's shoulders sagged. "Not much point some days," he said quietly. "Talking to a stone don't bring her back." The raw honesty of it hit Daniel like a punch. He hesitated, then held out the letters. "I didn't read them," he said quickly. "But I think Margaret would have wanted you to keep them safe." Samuel stared at him, his eyes glistening. Then slowly he took the letters and clutched them to his chest. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, voice rough. "Why care about some old wreck like me?" Daniel didn't have a perfect answer, but he knew one thing for certain. "Because everyone deserves to be remembered," he said softly. "Not just Margaret, you too." For the first time, Samuel's hardened expression wavered, just for a second, before he turned away. But Daniel had seen it, hope, flickering, fragile, but there. And that was enough to change everything. Word spread through Willowbrook like wildfire, not through gossip, but through something deeper, a quiet reckoning. Daniel hadn't meant to turn Samuel's life into a public story, but after their conversation at the train yard, he knew he couldn't keep what he'd learned to himself, not when Samuel's suffering had been invisible for so long. He started small, telling Gerald, the cemetery keeper, the truth about the homeless man everyone had ignored for years. Gerald, a Vietnam vet himself, listened in stunned silence, his weathered face growing paler with every word. By the next morning, half the town had heard some version of Samuel's story. The young husband sent to war, the wife who died while he was away, the decades of grief that followed. But it was Betty at the diner who took the first real step. She cornered Daniel over a cup of coffee, her voice low but fierce. "We can't just let him live like that," she said. "Not after what he's been through. Not in our town." Within days, a plan formed. The local church offered its spare room. The mechanic, whose father had served in Korea, promised to fix up an old donated truck for Samuel to use. Even the high school students, the same ones who'd once thrown pebbles at him, began collecting clothes and supplies in hushed, ashamed silence. Yet no one knew how Samuel would react. Pride was a fragile thing, and he'd spent a lifetime refusing handouts. Daniel volunteered to talk to him, but when he arrived at the train yard that evening, Samuel was already packing his meager belongings into a frayed duffel bag. He didn't look up as Daniel approached. "Figured you'd be back," he muttered. Daniel hesitated. "The town, they want to help, Samuel." Samuel's hand stilled. "I don't need pity." "It's not pity." Daniel took a step closer. "It's thanks." That made Samuel glance up, frowning. Daniel pressed on. "For serving. For loving Margaret all these years. For surviving when most people wouldn't have." His voice cracked. "Let us do this. Please." For a long moment, Samuel just stared at him, his eyes searching Daniel's face for some hint of deception. Then slowly, he exhaled. "Where would I go?" The question was so small, so hopeful, that Daniel had to blink back tears. "First, Betty's diner. She's got apple pie waiting." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips, the first Daniel had ever seen. "Her pie's terrible," Samuel murmured, but he picked up his bag, and for the first time in 56 years, he let someone walk beside him. The diner was unusually quiet when Samuel stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as if hesitant to announce his arrival. Every eye in the room turned toward him, not with the usual suspicion or discomfort he'd grown accustomed to, but with something far more unsettling: kindness. Betty emerged from behind the counter, her usual sharp demeanor softened at the edges, and without a word she pointed to a corner booth where a slice of apple pie sat waiting. steam still curling from its sugared crust. Samuel hesitated, his fingers tightening around the strap of his duffel bag, but Daniel's gentle nudge against his shoulder steadied him. Slowly, he made his way to the booth, the weight of decades of isolation pressing down on him, even as the warmth of the diner seeped into his bones. He expected questions, awkward attempts at conversation, but instead, the townspeople gave him space. They glanced his way occasionally, not staring, just checking, as if to reassure themselves he was real, that this fragile moment of connection wouldn't vanish like morning mist. It wasn't until he'd taken the first bite of pie, too sweet, just like he remembered, that the dam began to crack. An elderly man in a worn flannel shirt slid into the seat across from him, his gnarled hands resting on the table. "Knew your brother," the man said quietly. "James. Good man. He looked for you, you know. After." Samuel's fork clattered against the plate. He hadn't heard his brother's name spoken aloud in more years than he could count. The stranger didn't press, just nodded and stood, leaving Samuel with the echo of a family he'd thought lost forever. Over the next few days, the town's quiet efforts became impossible to ignore. The church's spare room turned out to be a small apartment above the bakery, its walls freshly painted, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. One Margaret had stitched, Betty admitted, her voice thick. The mechanic's old donated truck was a restored 1965 Ford, the same model Samuel had driven the summer before he shipped out. Each gesture was a thread, carefully woven, pulling him back into a world he'd thought had no place for him. But the real turning point came on a rain-soaked afternoon, when a woman appeared at the cemetery, her umbrella trembling in her grip as she stood before Margaret's grave. Samuel, who had come to leave his daily wildflower, froze at the sight of her. She turned, her eyes, Margaret's eyes, meeting his. "Uncle Samuel?" she whispered. The word struck him like lightning. The girl, no, the woman, was Margaret's niece, the baby she'd doted on in her letters, the one he'd never met. She held out a photograph, yellowed at the edges. Margaret, laughing, her arms around a little girl in a sundress. "She talked about you all the time," the woman said, tears spilling over. "She never stopped waiting for you." Samuel's knees gave out. Daniel, who had followed at a distance, caught him before he hit the ground. But it was the woman family who held him as he wept, her arms around his shoulders, her voice in his ear. "You're home now." And for the first time since 1968, Samuel believed it. The rain fell softly on the day they buried Samuel Grayson, a gentle murmur against the sea of black umbrellas crowding the cemetery. It had been 5 years since he'd stepped into Betty's diner that first time, 5 years of slow healing and unexpected joy, of Sunday dinners with Margaret's niece, Clara, and her children, of driving that old Ford to the VA hospital to sit with other veterans who, like him, had carried their wars in silence. The town had watched in quiet awe as Samuel rebuilt his life, not into what it once was, but into something new, something tender and resilient as spring grass pushing through cracked pavement. Now, as the priest spoke words of comfort, Clara stepped forward, her hands steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She unfolded a piece of paper, the edges worn soft from years of being tucked into Samuel's pocket. "This is the last letter he wrote to Aunt Margaret," she said, her voice clear in the hushed air. "He asked that I read it here today." The crowd leaned in as she began, the words simple, aching, full of a love that had outlasted death itself. "My dearest Margaret," Clara read, "I used to come here because it was the only place I could still feel you. But these last years, I've learned you weren't just here. You were in the sunlight on the bakery steps, in the laughter of Clara's boys, in the way this town took a broken old man and reminded him what it meant to belong. I don't know if letters reach heaven, but if they do, I hope you've been watching. I hope you know I stayed. I hope you know I finally came home." A collective breath released, wet with tears. Daniel, now the cemetery's head groundskeeper, knelt to place 2 items on Samuel's casket, a fresh wildflower and that faded photograph of Margaret, its edges smoothed by decades of Samuel's fingers. As the casket was lowered, the crowd began to disperse, but Clara lingered, her hand resting on the fresh earth. "You were right, Uncle," she whispered. "She was watching." And in the quiet that followed, As the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, no one doubted it. This story teaches us that grief, when carried alone, can become a prison, but kindness has the power to break its locks. Samuel's life was not defined by the war that took him from Margaret, nor by the decades he spent homeless and forgotten, but by the love that refused to fade and the community that finally saw him. His story reminds us that behind every stranger is a history etched in joy and sorrow, and that simple acts of compassion, a cup of coffee, a listening ear, a place to belong, can rewrite someone's ending. We live in a world quick to judge and slow to understand. Yet here, in the quiet solidarity of Willowbrook, we witness the truth. No one is beyond redemption, and no life is too broken to be mended. The greatest tribute to Samuel is not just the tears at his grave, but the choice to look beyond the surface of those still walking among us, aching to be remembered. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. And sometimes all it takes to restore it is one person willing to say, "I see you."
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.